Now I want to talk about the validity of the Constitution. Do we have a valid document? And I need to check, do you say, Mr. Chairman, that you want this segment concluded in an hour? I will put my watch up here, and if the time starts to run, please stamp your feet, or if the carpet is so good that please wave your hand or something. The chairman has very rightly said that he's laid down rules for these seminars. I'd like to say that I don't mind or object to a witty interjection. So if you feel like a witty interjection, please don't feel that you're going to disturb any presentation that I might have. I don't use a set text or even notes, so you won't be interrupting my flow. No. Thank you. There's a rumour going around that our Constitution, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, is not valid. And this rumour takes several lines. But basically, it's not valid in Australia, they say, because it is British law. It was passed by the Parliament in Westminster, not by the Parliament in Australia. Australia and Britain are now foreign countries. People from Australia visiting Britain go into the aliens queue. People from Australia have no rights of residence in Britain. That is true. I am admitted to practice as a lawyer in the United Kingdom. I hold a bank account in the United Kingdom. I have at least one university degree from a university in the United Kingdom. I think I speak the same language as they speak in the United Kingdom. The longest permission I can have to visit the United Kingdom is 6 months. That is the maximum, and I'm not allowed to do any work or do anything else while I'm there. However, I can go there without a visa. People from Britain coming to Australia need a visa to come here. So, you know, we started it. They didn't. I heard of the person who sought to migrate to Australia, for we do still accept migrants from Britain sometimes. I'm dealing with a dear lady at the moment. Her story is one that, or perhaps I shouldn't present it publicly. But I'm dealing with a dear lady from Britain at the moment who's had a great deal of difficulty getting a visa to come to Australia. As I say, we started it. Let's not complain too much that they're getting their own back a bit. It is true that Britain is a foreign country as far as we're concerned. It is true that we are an independent country from Britain. It is true that British law has, except to the extent that I've already mentioned, has no application anymore in Australia. When I say British law has no application in Australia, what I mean is that no matter what legislation the Parliament in Westminster passes, it doesn't apply to us. If Westminster says in its legislation every person in Australia will wear hats in the summer, it doesn't apply here any more than if the Parliament of Mexico passed that legislation. We are an independent country. We are not under the control of Britain. Not at all. But the historic law that has not been any historic laws that have not been repealed in Australia continue to apply here. Now, there has been some bulk repealing of United Kingdom laws, and there have been some laws in most states that have been specifically continued. Laws, there is a principle of desuetude, that when a law is not used for a very long time, that it no longer has application. So it is possible for you to be claiming something under a law of Britain that's not been specifically repealed, and for the court to say, oh, listen, that hasn't been used for 250 years. Don't you come telling us that that's relevant to Australia today, and we've been an independent country for I don't know how long, and don't you come with a law that's never been here. So don't be surprised if that happens to you. But what about our Constitution? Well, as I have just said, it is not a constitution in the ordinary sense of being a constitution, but it is an agreement among the states as to how they will operate together. How was this agreement to be put in place? The 6 states were colonies. Each of them had a large degree of independence at the time that the Constitution was passed in Britain. A large degree of independence. Well, let me just give a couple of little examples. The Universal Postal Union, a treaty but among many countries of the world in, I think it was 1884. Most states in Australia were parties to that treaty, separately from one another and separately from Britain. If any of those among us are interested in the history of Australia's fighting forces, you will be somewhat aware, I'm sure, of the Boer War. It's often said that Australian troops were in the Boer War. Is that right? Were there any Australian troops in the Boer War? Well, in one sense it's right. Most states sent contingents to the Boer War, quite separately of any decision in Britain. The decisions were taken locally, the payment was local, the recruitment was local, was nothing to do with Britain. The states acted independently in determining whether they would send forces to the Boer War or not. There were several Tasmanian regiments. They specially, I speak particularly of Tasmania, that's where I'm living at present, and perhaps know marginally more than I do about other states. I'm trying to suggest that I don't necessarily know very much, but Tasmania sent several regiments to the Boer War. They didn't go as Australian troops, they went as Tasmanian troops. They sent the Tasmanian Navy to the Boer War, the one ship that Tasmania had. So, yes, Australian troops were there in the sense that Tasmania is part of Australia, but they were not sent as an Australian contingent. And if anyone speaks of the Australian contingent in the Boer War, they are misleading you completely and totally and absolutely. If you are philatelists, you maybe collect the stamps of Australian states. Each state issued its own stamps, quite independently of the other states and of Britain. Now, how were they to come together? How were they to... Britain had certain legislative powers in relation to the state, although the states had a degree of independence. How were they to come together with a document that they could work under? Well, they could have done what America did. They could have said, we're going to have nothing more to do with you, England. I mean, you sent us all these wretched convicts. You've been a terrible nuisance over the years. We're going to have nothing to do with you. We declare Australia a united Australia or a Commonwealth of Australia as an independent country. We didn't do that. We said, please, would you pass legislation that we can use for this getting together of our peoples? They kindly did that for us. Did that establish Australia as an independent country? Australia, as apart from the states, as a country, as a nation in its own right, a nation not controlled by Britain at all. This is possibly the only point on which I agree with the late Lionel Murphy, formerly Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Australia and Justice of the High Court. He takes the view that the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution was the independence document of Australia, and so do I. Others take a completely different view. Some say, no, no, no. Australia did not become independent until the peace conference after the First World War, when Prime Minister William Hughes returned to Parliament and said, Australia is now an independent country. They say that that was the point, when Australia signed the peace treaty independently of Britain. Others say, no, 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 it wasn't then. It was at the time of the Imperial Conference in the late 1920s when it was recognised, and recognised by legislation in the United Kingdom, that the dominions were independent countries. Others say, no, 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 no. That was United Kingdom legislation again. You need to look to 1942, when that legislation was adopted in Australia by the Australian Parliament. Others say, no, 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 no. You need to look to the Australia Acts. The Prime Minister of the day came back from a visit to England and said, I've brought back the Australian Constitution to Australia. It's our own now. I don't know when you say Australia became independent. I've chosen my date for lots of legal reasons. If it ever becomes necessary, I'm prepared to argue it in court, and I expect to have the High Court uphold my submissions, but I don't think I'm ever going to have to argue it. The fact is, Australia is an independent country, and this is the document that the states agreed would be our basis of existence. It is pointless and hopeless to say that the Constitution doesn't exist, therefore we have no laws. We are anarchists in this country. The Constitution is invalid, therefore all the laws under the Constitution are invalid. Therefore you don't have to pay tax, for example. Because, now am I making myself clear that this is the basis on which we have been working since 1901, and there is a good reason why we're working on this basis. We did it, our ancestors did it peacefully, without any animosity, without any fighting. It just sort of flowed on. It is a question of the responsibility for running the country devolving on the new federal government and continuing with the states quite independently of Britain. Now, there have been some mistakes on the way through. That I agree. But the fact is, we have a working constitution, a good working constitution. Here I am calling it a constitution because that's what its official name is. We have a good working constitution. Let us not try to undermine it. Are there any things wrong with it? Well, yes, I would say there are. But there are some sections of the Constitution which were put in simply for the purpose of getting the federal body going. And they're finished. They have no longer any application. There are some provisions that were there where they said, we're not quite sure what we're going to want, so this provision will apply until there's federal legislation replacing it. There are other sections which the powers of the nation have decided should not really be looked at all. One has come to light over the years is Section 44. Section 44 is well known, I think, probably to all of us. I'm not going to give you a long legal treatise on this or anything else, but Section 44, among other things, provides that no person who is under any acknowledgement of allegiance, obedience, or adherence to a foreign power, or is a subject or a citizen, or entitled to the rights or privileges of a subject or citizen of a foreign power, shall be capable of being chosen or sitting as a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. How many members of the House of Representatives have dual nationality? There are quite a lot. Do you know that anyone born in the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland, or whose father or whose paternal grandfather was born in those places, has the right of citizenship that's entitled to the rights or privileges of a subject or citizen of a foreign power? And we've just been discussing about Britain being a foreign power. Anyone whose grandfather, paternal grandfather, was born there has rights of citizenship in the United Kingdom and therefore cannot sit in our federal parliament. How many of your members of parliament had their paternal grandfather born in the United Kingdom, if not their father or even themselves? The same rule of rights to citizenship applies in a number of other countries. I can't give you a list of them now, although I believe I have a list in my file at home. Who takes any notice of Section 44? No one, except when it suits them. Yes, the case of Sue against Hill, Senator Hill, was the matter that I was particularly thinking of. That was not the first time that it has suited them to take notice of this section. But in general terms, they take no notice of it at all. Can you bring proceedings challenging your federal member when you discover that he has rights of citizenship in another country? Well, it's terribly, terribly complicated. They introduced an act which both sides of Parliament supported, called the Common Informers Act. And you need to bring proceedings under the Common Informers Act. And that, you will find when you look at it, is not easy to do. So it seems to me quite clear that it was intended that any person could complain about someone seeking to sit in the House of Representatives or actually sitting. But you're not allowed to do that anymore. Does that mean that that section is invalid? No, it doesn't mean that. It's just scarcely used. Tonight, over dinner, we will be looking at a couple of sections relating to the Governor-General, which are not used now, and I believe should be, and I personally think we should be demanding that they be used, because it's here in the Constitution. So I say to you that the Constitution is a valid document. I say to you it is a good document. I say to you that it is a document that is worth preserving in its general format, in its general idea. You might say that I should be talking about a head of state when I'm talking about the Governor-General. There is a major group in Australia now that is pressing for the establishment of an Australian head of state. The Republican movement has really focused in on this question of an Australian as head of state. I must say that the term head of state is a term historically not known in our law or constitutional structure. We are a constitutional monarchy with a sovereign. Head of state is a term known in republics. Republics need a head of state because they don't have a constitutional sovereign. All right, surely I'm quibbling over words, aren't I? Just quibbling over words. Tell me, if I'm quibbling over words, tell me, what is a head of state? What is the function of a head of state? Perhaps to assent to legislation? Of course, some would say no, a head of state shouldn't have to assent to legislation, but it is a common function of a head of state to sign assent to legislation. A head of state receives diplomatic representatives from other countries. He commissions diplomatic representatives of his own country to go to other states. He commissions officers of the armed forces. He swears in the Parliament. He declares elections. What else does a head of state do? If anyone has any suggestions, I'd be very pleased to know, maybe in question time. Who does these things for Australia? The Governor-General. No one else. The Queen has no power to do them. The Queen has no power to do them. Is our present Governor-General an Australian? Do you want an Australian for head of state? You got one, haven't you? Perhaps what the Republican movement is asking for at this time is let us change the name of the office from Governor-General to head of state. That wouldn't trouble me. It wouldn't trouble me at all if they just changed the name. And that seems to me to be what they're asking for at this moment. When it comes to the crunch, I think they will be asking for other things. In fact, I'm sure they'll be asking for other things. But they're just saying at this moment an Australian as head of state. I've heard recently several people say the Constitution has let me down. I have not been able to exercise my rights under the Constitution. Look, they're not even here. Look, I don't get a right to a jury under the Constitution. Oh yes, it talks about juries, but that doesn't give me any right to a jury in South Australia. I was charged with a motoring offence the other day, and I said I wanted a jury, and they wouldn't let me have one. The Constitution has let me down. The jury is fundamental to the administration of a law in a free country. My friends, don't blame the Constitution. It's got nothing to do with the Constitution. You might want a jury. There might be. You might say you have a right to a jury. If you think you have a right to a jury, you tell your state member of parliament, if he'll listen to you. Now, it flows on from this some of the crazy things that are being promoted around Australia at the moment. You know, you don't have to register your motor vehicles. Somebody's done a great deal of research on this and has found that that you can pay some money, forgive me, to him, and he will organise, or you can do it yourself if you want to. He will organise for you to have lifetime registration of your motor vehicle. Save you a lot of money, won't it? And you'll manage very well until the police catch up with you. Oh, but we'll go to court. We'll represent you in court. Has anyone been successfully represented in court on this issue? If you know of anyone, please let me know, because I certainly don't, and I know that I would not seek to represent anyone who was charged with failing to register his motor vehicle and who wanted to plead guilty on the ground that he had obtained a lifetime motor vehicle registration. I was asked recently to represent somebody in Victoria who was charged with parking or parking over time. But you see, this particular person was part of the royal family of the Principality of something or other and claimed diplomatic immunity. And I was asked to go to court to present the diplomatic immunity claim. I said, not on your life. And the fact is that every other lawyer they approached said, not on your life too. And the poor lady was duly convicted on her parking offence. It would have saved her a lot of effort if she just paid the fine in the first place. Now what about my tax? Do I have to pay tax? You see, the tax department is not a legal entity. The tax department doesn't exist. You go through all the registers of legal entities in Australia and you won't find the tax department there because it doesn't exist. And the Commissioner of Taxation. If the tax department doesn't exist, well, the Commissioner of Taxation, of course, can't exist either. My friends, the Taxation Department is simply an instrument of the Commonwealth Government. And we might not like the Tax Department. I can't say the Tax Department is my friend or that I am theirs. But be that as it may, they have the legal right in this country to demand taxes from me, including goods and services tax. And if I don't pay, I will have an order against me, and I might even go to jail if I don't obey the order. I would go to jail for contempt of court rather than for failing to pay my tax. I had a lovely experience several years ago. I did something that I never do. Why I did it, I don't know. I took my wife's tax bill into the local tax department and paid over the counter the tax that my wife owed. And I got a receipt from the tax department. My wife, of course, received a letter saying you failed to pay your tax. We will be instituting proceedings without further notice in 7 days. Proceedings were instituted. They were instituted by an individual whose name was Carmody. And were not introduced. The tax department, which correctly does not exist as an entity, it's the Commonwealth Government. The complainant could have been the Commonwealth of Australia or any individual person. And it turned out to be somebody named Carmody, who I've heard of, as I expect most of us have. What happened next? Before we went into court, my courage failed me. And I rang up the lawyers for the tax department. And I said, you know, it's a terrible chore going to court on this, and I think you ought to drop the case. And he said, no, your wife has clearly not paid her tax. And I said, oh, well, we'll talk about that in court, won't we? And the day before the hearing, he rang me up and called me a number of names. And he said, you might have told me you'd paid it and that you had a receipt for it. So it was all my fault, you know. Anyway, of course, the matter did not proceed. In a way, a pity, still and all. Now, this question of whether you have to pay your tax has been to the High Court on a couple of occasions. On one occasion, the judge made a comment saying, look, I'm not going to upset the system by listening to your nonsense, or some such. And it's been said that the judges are not interested in justice, they just want to maintain the system. Well, that's not what the judge was meaning at all. He was saying, look, your case is ridiculous. Now, on these cases and other similar stupid cases, the High Court has introduced a new rule, a rule which you will find hits you very hard if you seek to use counsel, legal counsel, to represent you in the High Court. Because the new rule is that any lawyer who brings a stupid case that is found against his client must pay the costs himself. The lawyer must pay the costs. Of course, he should know better. You will find it extremely difficult to obtain legal counsel on a stupid case that is bound to fail. And some say that this has been done in order to keep justice out of the courts. Really, I would concede that there might be some things that are happening to keep justice out of the courts, but that is not one of them. That is to keep the courts from being barraged with nonsense. There is a poor man in Queensland. Unfortunately, I forget his name, who didn't register his motor vehicle with the Queensland Registration Authority. And he has been, I'm not sure whether he's still in jail or not, but he was in jail for many months, for he was charged by the police with driving an unregistered motor vehicle. He went before the magistrate and had a great team of supporters in the court with him, and he said, I'm perfectly well registered and I've got a very good argument, and I'm going to show you that I'm entitled to have my vehicle registered. And the magistrate said, well, I'm going to have to adjourn the case because I just can't hear a plea of not guilty of the length that you're indicating now. But you are admitting that your vehicle is not registered in accordance with the Queensland law. Accordingly, I issue an order that you're not to drive that motor vehicle until this case is heard. And I set a date for next March for it to be heard. unless you register the vehicle under the Queensland law. And he went outside, got into his car and drove off with the police car behind him. And the police brought him back to the court and said, we've just picked up this man for driving the car that we complained about in the first place. And the magistrate said, oh, you did you? Well, I've got no alternative but to remand you in custody until the case is heard. Not on the charge, but on a charge of contempt of court. So, if you've received emails, as I have, about this poor man who's been jailed for many months without trial because he has legally and properly registered his motor vehicle in a way that will give him free registration for life, and he is being persecuted, please understand that he hasn't been detained on the charge of failing to register his motor vehicle. He's been detained on the charge of contempt of court. He appealed to the visiting justice at the jail, and the visiting justice said, ha ha, you just stay there. Now, if I were the magistrate, I'm afraid I would have treated him in a very similar way. Maybe somebody here can remind me of his name, but I've forgotten it. The point, I think you're right, was suggested that the name is Townsend. I think it might be too. It certainly rings a bell of rightness. I feel sorry for the poor man in custody, but after all, what else could he expect? And I say to you, what can you expect if you don't obey the laws? Oh, you've got freedom, you can do it another way. You can determine to drive on the right-hand side of the road instead of the left-hand side, can't you? In the Kingdom of Lesotho, where I used to work, it is common. It's a left-hand rule. It's common for the locals to drive on the right of the road. It makes it very difficult for those who are obeying the law, because you come round a bend and there you find a car doing 60 miles an hour or 100 kilometres an hour right in front of you. And there tends to be a screeching of metal. So, what I am saying is that any suggestion you make that the Constitution is invalid is doomed to failure. Was the Constitution Act even signed, was assent given to it by the Queen? I don't know. Some careful researcher has approached the Parliament of the United Kingdom, approached the Records Office of the House of Lords and said, would you please find out whether the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act was ever ratified? And it's got a reply saying, really don't know. I've got a copy of it here, actually. Really don't know, perhaps it wasn't. My friends, nowhere is there a requirement that the ratification must be signed or sealed under the Great Seal. It has to be ratified. It has to be approved. And nowhere does it say that it requires a signature. Actually, the same applies to the Governor-General, although the Governor-General does, as practice, always sign his approval or disapproval, as the case may be. So, really, that is a complete furphy, whether it was signed and sealed or not. And the documents that somebody has kindly placed in my hands do not go 1 inch of the way towards declaring the invalidity of the Constitution. There is one organisation, well, maybe there are more, that have drawn up a new constitution for Australia, there's some very interesting things in the draft. I could run through them with you now, but I don't really propose to. It was disclosed or revealed or whatever at an activity in Ballarat or near Ballarat in a celebration just this year. It is a hopeless document, if I may say so. Be that as it may, there are organisations that have come into existence, like the Principality of Campside, of which the Governor or Governor-General or something is Dr. David Simonton. There's been a sort of a breakaway, whether that's the breakaway or whether the Principality of Caledonia has broken away from Campside, I don't know. But there's Campside and there's Caledonia, which have declared themselves to be independent. Campside and Caledonia have borders absolutely identical to the borders of Australia, and they are in the process of establishing governments, legal governments to take over from the illegal government of Australia. Because you see, if the Constitution is invalid, and if the Governor-General is invalidly appointed, which I'll be talking about later, then the Parliament is totally invalid because the Governor-General could not commission the Prime Minister or ministers, and the elections could not have taken place because the elections are invalid and illegal too. Therefore, we need a proper government, and Campside and Caledonia are organising this, so there will be nothing to fear, because they're in a position to take over. And indeed, I understand one of them at least has petitioned or approached the United Nations for recognition. You know what will happen to that, don't you? The answer is absolutely nothing. They might get might have had a polite reply from somebody. Then, of course, there is the Central Queensland Free State. Central Queensland Free State has also declared its independence. It does have its own borders. It's independent of Australia. It's establishing its own bank. It will probably establish its own currency. It might well establish its own postage stamps, like Prince Leonard has at Hutt River. Now, Prince Leonard's Hutt River is a very different proposition from Central Queensland or from Campside and Caledonia. Yes, Prince Leonard has his own stamps, which are valid and usable within Hutt River Province, which is the property that he owns in Western Australia. Yes, there is a motor vehicle registration, a valid motor vehicle registration for Hutt River Province. It ceases to be valid as soon as the vehicle crosses out of his private property onto a public road. While they're on his private roads, he can have domestic house rules. He can act in a totalitarian way to establish his domestic house rules, that any vehicles driving on the roads on his property must have his registration. So we've got the stamps, so stamp collectors buy his stamps. He issues passports. Are his passports usable? Yes, they're usable to get into his property, to get out of his property, but they're not usable anywhere else. There's a video running around called for "We Are Young and Free," I think, in which one of the speakers mentions the Aboriginal passport he holds, and he's able to use that in the indigenous territories in the United States and in other places, but he's not able to use it to get into any country. He arrives in Australia, and the immigration officer at the airport says, "That's no good, fella. you got to produce your Australian passport. He says, but, you know, if I'm not producing a valid passport, you can send me back to my own country, and that's Australia. So send me back to Australia, will you? But I understand that on each occasion he has produced his Australian passport. Otherwise, I think he would have gone to jail. He's quite an intelligent man who really, in my opinion, ought to know a lot better than to try that funny stuff. I would find it fascinating trying to use a Hutt River passport or an Aboriginal passport or a campsite or one of the other passports for travelling overseas. I'd find it great fun. But I would have a little problem. If I were claiming dual citizenship, I would never be able to stand for the federal parliament. If I were claiming citizenship of the Aboriginal nation or of campsite, I could never stand for parliament. I must say to you that there are many, in fact there are hundreds of loyal, wonderful Australians seeking to set this country right, throwing their efforts behind campsite or Caledonia or Central Queensland Free State or Upmart. And it is such a pity, for what they are doing is, first of all, they're seeking to undermine our current legal structure. Really, I can only say that they are acting in the way that an anarchist would act. The country is to be run my way. I know better. I am going to establish a new world on my principles. Please don't be diffused or deluded into doing these things. I do not know why the Australian government authorities are not more concerned about what is going on. I understand that the ASIO is not even keeping files on these people. They say, oh no, they're harmless, they're just lunatics. Both of those might be true, I don't know. But let's not be taken. I say to you, let's put our hearts, minds and shoulders into an effort to recover godly government in this land. A questioner has asked just a few moments ago, what do I mean by godly government? Now, I'm not at this moment intending to expand on that any further, because I must move on. I say to you that our laws, in general terms, are valid laws. I say in general terms because there are some that demonstrably are not valid. Back on my hobby horse of the goods and services tax, I'm not even sure that the goods and services tax is valid under the Constitution. Top lawyers advised the Labor Party after that election that the goods and services tax was not valid under the Constitution, and the Labor Party declared that it would be bringing proceedings in the High Court to challenge it. They never did. Interesting. They never did. Now, Central Queensland Free State is interesting, for they are at present establishing their own bank. I presume they're establishing their own currency. I presume they're establishing their own postage stamps. We will see what happens. I say, just be careful. Look, among these people who are acting, I believe, with the best will in the world, I have many personal friends. Some of them feel that I'm defecting to the enemy by not supporting them. And I feel the reverse in general terms. I did have a very interesting experience with the leaders of one of these interesting organisations 2.5 years ago. He graciously invited me to visit him, and I did. And I stayed in his home, and I was looked after very, very well. And he gave me a rundown on the future, what is going to happen in world history and in Australian history in the next few years. And he put timelines on it all. And I said, oh, this is all very interesting. How do you know these things? And he said, well, God has told me. And I said, look, I suppose it's possible for God to tell somebody. From my point of view, God doesn't usually work in that way, but I suppose it's possible. Why are you specially chosen? He said, I'll let you into a secret. I'm a reincarnation of Daniel, the prophet Daniel from the Old Testament. I am the reincarnation, and God speaks to me the way he used to speak to Daniel. That's how I know. Now, of course, I immediately became deeply concerned about that man and his future.